The funeral, March 21st, 1987. The funeral was over. 300 people had paid their respects. Dean Martin sat alone in the front row, his son's casket 15 feet away. He hadn't moved in 3 hours. Then Clint Eastwood sat down next to him, said nothing, just sat. 5 minutes of silence. Dean turned to Clint. His face was dry, no tears. He said something about a plane, about fear, about the day his son asked him to fly. What Dean said next made Clint Eastwood, a man who rarely shows emotion, break down crying. And it revealed the secret Dean had been carrying for 13 years. March 21st, 1987. Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. The sky was gray, not raining, just gray, like the weather knew what had happened. Captain Dean Paul Martin Jr. was dead, 35 years old. F-4 Phantom II fighter jet crashed during Air National Guard training exercise. The wreckage was found in the San Bernardino Mountains. There wasn't much left to bury. Dean Martin's oldest son, the boy he'd flown with in that tiny Cessna 13 years ago, the pilot who'd made his terrified father smile for 45 minutes straight, gone. The funeral was massive, 300 people. Frank Sinatra was there, Sammy Davis Jr., Bob Newhart, Shirley MacLaine, every major name in Hollywood. They came because Dino Jr. was loved. They came because Dean Martin was Hollywood royalty. They came to pay respects. Dean Martin sat in the front pew, black suit, black tie. His face was expressionless, not crying, not moving, just staring at the flag-draped casket 15 feet in front of him. His son in a box. Dean's silence. The service lasted 2 hours. Prayers, eulogies, military honors. Dino Jr.'s Air Force colleagues spoke about his service, his skill, his dedication. Friends talked about his humor, his kindness, his passion for flying. Dean Martin didn't speak, couldn't speak, didn't cry, couldn't cry, just sat there frozen. People noticed, whispered about it. He's in shock. Grief does strange things. Give him time. But Dean wasn't in shock. He was somewhere else, somewhere in 1974, in a tiny Cessna, gripping the armrest, smiling at his son, lying about being okay. The service ended. The organist played. People stood, filed out slowly, respectful, sad. They approached Dean, touched his shoulder, said things he didn't hear. "I'm so sorry. He was a wonderful young man. If you need anything." Dean nodded, automatic, not really present. Bent down, whispered something. Dean nodded again. Frank squeezed his shoulder and left. One by one, they left, until the chapel was nearly empty, just Dean and his son's casket and the terrible silence. Dean didn't move, couldn't move. His hands were gripping the pew in front of him, knuckles white. He'd been sitting there for 3 hours, hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk water, hadn't gone to the bathroom, just sat, staring. A funeral director approached gently. "Mr. Martin, we need to, it's time to..." Dean didn't respond. The funeral director looked at Dean's daughter, Deanna. She shook her head. "Give him a few more minutes." They left him alone. The chapel was now empty, just Dean and the casket and the gray light coming through the stained glass windows. Then footsteps, slow, steady, coming down the aisle. Clint Eastwood. He'd been at the funeral, in the back, hadn't approached Dean during the receiving line, just observed, respectful, quiet. Now he walked back in, alone, down the center aisle. His footsteps echoed in the empty chapel. Dean didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him, just kept staring at the casket. Clint reached the front pew, didn't say anything. No, I'm sorry for your loss. No, he was a good man. No, if you need anything. He just sat down next to Dean, left 2 feet of space between them, and sat. Silence. Not uncomfortable silence, not awkward silence, just silence. 1 minute passed. Dean's breathing was shallow, his hands still gripping the pew, his eyes still locked on the casket. Clint sat, hands folded, looking straight ahead, not at Dean, not at the casket, just ahead. 2 minutes. Outside, cars were starting, people leaving. The funeral was over, life continuing. But in this chapel, time had stopped. 3 minutes. Dean's grip on the pew loosened slightly. His breathing steadied. The presence of another person, someone not trying to comfort him, not trying to say the right thing, just being there. It was somehow more helpful than all 300 condolences combined. 4 minutes. Clint didn't move, didn't speak, just sat.
This was what Dean needed. Not words, not sympathy, just someone willing to sit in the grief with him, not trying to fix it, not trying to make it better, just acknowledging it. 5 minutes. Then Dean Martin spoke. First words in 3 hours. His voice was rough, unused, barely above a whisper. 1974. Clint didn't respond, didn't look at him, just listened. Dino got his pilot's license, May 1974. He was 22 years old. Dean's voice was steady, no emotion, just facts, like he was reading a report. He asked me to be his first passenger. Clint remained still, listening. And Dean Martin started telling a story about a plane, about fear, about the last time he'd felt his son was truly proud of him. The confession. I was terrified of flying, Dean said, his voice flat, emotionless. Everyone knew, it wasn't a secret. I hated small planes, especially hated them. Clint sat, listened. My doctor told me not to do it, said my heart couldn't take it. Small plane, that altitude, the stress, he said it could trigger a heart attack. Dean's hands released the pew completely now, fell into his lap. But Dino asked me. He was so excited. He'd worked so hard for that license, and he wanted me to be his first passenger. Not Frank, not Sammy. Me, his father. For the first time, emotion crept into Dean's voice. Small, barely noticeable, but there. So I said yes. I got on that plane, a tiny Cessna, 4 seats, single engine. It looked like a toy. Dean's breath caught. He continued. The moment the engine started, I knew I'd made a mistake. My heart was racing. My hands were shaking. I was gripping the armrest so hard I left marks in the leather. A pause. We took off, and for 45 minutes I was the most terrified I'd ever been in my life. I thought I was going to die. I thought my heart was going to explode. I thought the plane was going to fall out of the sky. Dean turned to look at Clint for the first time. His face was still dry, no tears, but his eyes were hollow. But Dino kept looking back at me, checking on me, making sure I was okay. And every single time he looked back, I smiled. I gave him a thumbs up. I said, "You're doing great, son. This is fantastic." Dean's voice cracked slightly. I lied. For 45 minutes straight, I lied to my son because I didn't want him to know I was terrified. I didn't want to ruin his moment. I wanted him to believe his father was proud and fearless. A long pause. The moment we landed, I got out of the plane and threw up right there on the tarmac. Dino was horrified. He thought he'd done something wrong. He apologized over and over. Dean's hands were trembling now. And I pulled him into a hug, and I told him it was the best flight of my life. I told him he was incredible. I told him I was so proud. The trembling got worse. He believed me. He never knew the truth. For 13 years, he thought his father had enjoyed that flight. He thought I was proud and unafraid. Dean's voice finally broke. And now he's dead in a plane, the thing I feared most, the thing I was terrified of. It took my son. The first tear fell, just one. He died thinking I was proud of him, but he never knew the truth. I lied to him, and now I can never tell him. Dean put his face in his hands. He died believing I was brave, but I was just a coward who smiled. And Dean Martin, the man who never cried in public, who'd made a career of effortless cool, who'd performed through every hardship, broke down. Clint's response: he knew. Clint Eastwood sat silent, watching Dean Martin cry for the first time in 3 hours. A minute passed. Dean's shoulders shook, no sound, just silent tears, years of them, stored up, released. Then Clint spoke. His voice was low, measured, the way he always spoke. He knew. Dean's crying slowed. He looked up, face wet, confused. What? He knew, Clint repeated. Dino Jr. knew you were terrified. Dean shook his head. No, I hid it. I smiled every time. He was a pilot, Clint interrupted, gentle but firm. A trained military pilot. He knew what fear looks like. He knew what white knuckles mean. He knew what forced smiles are. Dean stared at him. Clint continued. Your son wasn't naive. He'd flown with scared passengers before, in the Air Force, in training. He knew exactly what terror looks like in a passenger's eyes. A pause. He knew you were terrified, and he knew you got on the plane anyway. Dean's breath caught. That's why it mattered, Clint said. Not because you weren't scared, because you were scared, and you did it anyway. Clint turned to look at Dean directly. You think you lied to him. You think you hid your fear and robbed him of the truth. But Dean, he saw the truth. He saw your father, a man who was genuinely terrified, get on a plane because his son asked him to. Clint's voice was steady, clear. He didn't think you were fearless. He knew you were terrified, and that's what made it meaningful, because fearless people don't sacrifice anything. But you sacrificed your safety, your comfort, your pride for him.
A long silence. You didn't lie to him, Clint said. You loved him, and he knew it. Dean Martin stared at Clint Eastwood, and something in those words, spoken by a man who rarely spoke at all, broke through the grief, not healing it, not fixing it, but making it bearable. You think so? Dean's voice was small, childlike. I know so, Clint said, because if he thought you weren't afraid, the flight wouldn't have mattered. It would have just been another day with Dad. But knowing you were terrified, and seeing you smile anyway, that showed him something more important than courage. It showed him love. Clint put his hand on Dean's shoulder, firm, steady. He knew, Dean, and he loved you for it. And Dean Martin, 69 years old, broken, hollowed out by grief, leaned into that hand and cried. Really cried. The kind of crying that comes from release, from permission to stop carrying the weight alone. Clint stayed, didn't move, just held his shoulder for as long as Dean needed. The aftermath. Dean Martin never performed again after March 21st, 1987. His manager tried. His friends tried. Frank Sinatra personally begged him to come back. The stage will help, Frank said. The music will heal you. Dean refused. I'm done, he said. And he was. For 8 years, Dean Martin existed. He didn't live. He existed. He stayed in his house, watched TV, drank. Not the fun drinking, not the stage drinking, the kind of drinking that's slow suicide. His family watched him deteriorate, couldn't stop it, couldn't reach him. He died with Dino Jr. his daughter Deanna said years later. The funeral was just his body catching up to his heart. On Christmas Day, 1995, Dean Martin died. Acute respiratory failure. 78 years old. 8 years, 9 months, and 4 days after his son. The funeral was smaller, quieter. The Hollywood royalty came again, but there was less spectacle, more sadness. This wasn't tragic death. This was expected death. Welcomed death, maybe. Clint Eastwood was there. He sat in the back, like he had at Dino Jr.'s funeral. Didn't approach the family during the receiving line, just observed, paid respects. After the service, a reporter caught him. "Mr. Eastwood, you attended both funerals, Dean Jr.'s and Dean Sr.'s. Were you close to the Martin family?" Clint paused. He didn't usually talk to reporters, didn't like interviews, but something about this question made him stop. "I wasn't close," Clint said, "but I respected Dean. He was a good father." The reporter pressed. "What makes you say that?" Clint looked at the chapel, at Dean's casket being carried out. "Because he loved his son more than he loved his own life, and when his son died, he chose to follow him. Not immediately, but eventually. That's love. Destructive, maybe, but love." The reporter didn't know how to respond to that. Clint walked away, didn't elaborate, didn't explain about the conversation in the chapel, about the plane, about the fear, about the secret Dean carried. Some things are private. Some things stay between two men sitting in silence. Clint Eastwood kept that promise for years, until 2015, 20 years after Dean's death, when he finally told the story. 2015. In 2015, Clint Eastwood gave a rare interview. He was 85 years old, still working, still directing, still the same quiet, stoic man he'd always been. The interviewer asked about old Hollywood, about the people he'd known, about Dean Martin. Dean Martin gets remembered as the drunk guy with the martini glass, the comedian, the singer, the guy who made it look easy. He paused. But that's not who he was, not really. The interviewer leaned in. Dean Martin was a father who got on a plane he was terrified of because his son asked him to. And when that son died in a plane, the thing Dean feared most, it destroyed him. Clint's voice was measured, deliberate. At Dino Jr.'s funeral, Dean told me something. He thought he'd lied to his son by hiding his fear. He carried that guilt for 8 years, until it killed him. Clint looked directly at the camera. But here's what I told him, and what I want everyone to know. Dino Jr. knew his father was terrified. He was a trained pilot. He recognized fear. And he knew his father got on the plane anyway. That's what made it meaningful. A pause. Dean didn't lie. He loved. And sometimes love looks like smiling through terror. Sometimes love looks like getting on the plane. Sometimes love looks like choosing your child's pride over your own safety. Clint's voice was firm, clear. Dean Martin wasn't a coward for smiling through fear. He was a father. And when his son died, he died too. Just took 8 years for his body to catch up. The interviewer asked one more question. "Do you think Dean is at peace now?" Clint didn't hesitate. "I think he's with his son, and that's all he ever wanted after March 21st, 1987. The lesson. This is the story of a father who flew because his son asked, and a father who stopped living because his son couldn't. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is get on the plane. Sometimes the hardest thing you can do is keep living when you don't want to."
Dean Martin did both, and when he couldn't do the second anymore, he stopped trying. If this story about a father's love and a father's grief moved you, remember this: fear doesn't make you a coward. Fear makes you human. And overcoming fear for someone you love, that's what makes you a father. Dean Martin got on the plane in 1974, and in 1987, when that plane took his son, a part of Dean got on too. He just stayed behind long enough to finish grieving. 8 years, 9 months, 4 days. Then he followed. Because that's what fathers do. They protect their children, even when their children are gone, even when it destroys them, even when the only way to be with them again is to stop fighting. Dean Martin fought for 8 years. Then he let go. And finally, he flew again. This time without fear, because his son was waiting.